Thank you everyone, and thank you to the ISC for the invitation to be part of the discussion. Regional equality, so actual session description. Regional equality is rising despite the contribution to our economy through exports. How can we plan, deliver and operate infrastructure to optimise intergenerational value in regions? So this is actually a topic very close to my heart. So I'm based in Darwin and have been for a little over a year. And as part of the territory-wide I-body, we have remit over some of the most remote parts of the territory and actually some of the most remote and sparsely populated areas in the world. But we're also home to some of Australia's largest export projects, and in my opinion, one of the most important things we need to do is to make sure that together we ensure that every Australian in every region has access to the benefits that will flow from those projects. So I'm very pleased to have the discussion with my panellists, Georgine, Louis and Kate. Sorry, I should introduce you properly because I had it down that you... So
it's all up there.
It is all up there. Well, that makes it a lot easier. So I think for a start, we were going to get a little of context about our role. Obviously, you can read our roles and our organisations, but I thought we'd give a bit of context because really what we do is much more than those roles. So for mine, infrastructure all across the NT, both new build and existing, social and economic. Within our team, we have oversight of projects such as the $515 million shiplift, which will be the largest shiplift in Northern Australia. We have the Middle Arm Sustainable Development Precinct, which is around 1,200 hectares of industrial land that will focus on natural gas, renewable energies to grow manufacturing, low emissions technologies, green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. My specific role is freight and logistics, so I manage the lease of Darwin Port, the rail line, all that sort of infrastructure across the NT. And earlier this year we were committed, there was $440 million committed to regional logistics hubs across the NT, so that's my project to deliver over the next 5 years. So it's a pretty exciting space up there with a lot to do. So I thought perhaps, Georgine, we might throw to you, to your role and your remit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tracy. And hi, everyone. Really great to be here. Georgine Rudenrees, partner at Deloitte. I'm currently leading the development of the circular economy practice for Deloitte. But I guess it's sort of where I've come from that I guess leads into the particular perspective I take in the work that I do for Deloitte. For the last 6 years, I've been the Executive Director of Climate Change Policy in Queensland. And for those who are from Queensland here, you'll know, and for others that don't, you know, the regional story in Queensland has been so fundamental to being able to get the licence to really bring forward climate policy. And we had the magnificent announcement of the Queensland Energy Plan just very recently in the last couple of weeks. It's a very, very exciting time for Queensland now that we've got a sort of a singular direction, I suppose, to go forward on. Sort of in my time with Queensland Government, I was very involved in the regional conversation, I suppose. We had a program called Communities in Transition that was very much about empowering communities to have a discussion about their future, providing them the evidence of the challenges that were coming, and then really asking them how they felt in the light of those challenges, and really then using their strengths and values, how they saw the world going forward. So that work has sort of has been very foundational for me, and I suppose as I look at circular economy, we're looking at that in the context of industrial policy particularly, and really sort of trying to understand how it is that we can get a better deal if our industry policy is going to be effectively based around industrial clusters, regional industrial clusters. How do we get a better deal for regional communities, and how do we make sure that they really sort of can thrive in the face of the sort of enormous economic development that will happen in this sort of transition to net zero. So that's a bit of my perspective in terms of the commentary that we'll give later in the panel. Louis.
Louis Bettini, Principal Advisor, Sustainability. I look after corporate sustainability at Main Roads, plus oversee our approach to infrastructure sustainability ratings within our major projects. As well as that, I thought I'd just introduce a little bit about myself. I actually grew up in remote and remote Western Australia in the Pilbara region on cattle stations that are impacted by the trials and tribulations of being a long way from local communities, but also working with Indigenous people, and we've definitely I've definitely had an upbringing that has been close to home with some of the stories that have been shared so far around Aboriginal participation and what they've gone through, and I've seen it firsthand as part of my upbringing. So yeah, in terms of Main Roads and its role in the region, so we operate out of 8 regional offices. We're the most geographically spread organisation in the world, and with that there's some issues around equality or equity of infrastructure that are very much at the forefront of what we do as an organisation. So we've maintained those 8 regional offices a little bit on purpose, because we understand the impact that those offices have in those communities. They're often the lifeblood of those communities, just there in terms of their workforce, and those decisions around the workforce in those areas can definitely affect those towns going forward. But at the end of the day, it's our infrastructure investments and how we leverage that as an organisation which really impacts on this issue.
Okay.
I'm Kate Summers, I'm Principal Consultant Power Systems for Acustica. I'm an electrical engineer in power and control engineering, and I've been working in the national electricity market for over, I predate it. So I've been around it for, I've been around the power system for about 28 years now. And really, I started prior to the market, so I understand what it was like when we had a system that was operated purely by engineers. And I now try to make sense out of what we're doing in the regulatory space with the market and try to equate that to what power engineers are taught about how to control the power system. Because where the market is going and what our textbooks say are 2 different things. And it's quite complex for young engineers to actually understand what that distinction is. Now, what does that have to do with regions? I work on the largest infrastructure projects in the NEM, as well as right down to the smallest, most remote little power systems around regional Northern Territory. The Ord power system, I've been deeply involved in the Ord power system when I was at Pacific Hydro, and I certainly understand what the implications are for regions when their power systems are not reliable. So if you lose your electricity, not only does the beer go warm, but the lights go out and a few other things stop working as well. So you can't pump your water, your sewage won't be treated. There's a number of things that happen as a result of your essential service, which is electricity, stops working. And it's quite critical. And we all know what the fallout was when South Australia went black. I won't mention that too much, but you know, it has a consequence.
It was controversial.
It was controversial. So we blame the smallest generators in the system. So I think that gives you a bit of a sight to me. Yeah.
That's great. And when we talked in our pre-conference discussion, we were talking about getting into a little context setting, and I think I've taken that out of the conference, is that I think the way we look in the territory about our regions is probably a little bit different to people who operate in an urban system. So we consider our 165,000 people in Darwin as our big smoke, that's our urban setting. And our regions are Katherine, Tennant, Alice Springs, so 1,500, 1,800, 2,000 people, that's our regions. And our remote is where you can go hundreds of kilometres without seeing, you know, another person. And you probably have to drive from Queensland to Darwin to sort of really appreciate how sparse those regions are. So when we're talking about providing infrastructure there, There's real regional equality issues, I believe, but there's also very much, we're only going to get these things done if we do them in a sustainable way. We don't have the networks, we don't have the water supply systems to do them in a way if we don't do them sustainably. But also we just simply won't get the social license to operate in these regions unless we do it with that imperative. But we also have some national scale opportunities up there. We have 27 projects that we consider our major projects, and they're at a scale of, like one example is the Sun Cable project that'll be supplying 15% of Singapore's energy with renewable energy coming out of solar in the desert north of Tennant Creek. So right now you've got nothing there other than some remote, very, very, very remote communities. So that's a huge infrastructure task, and it's a huge logistics task, but it's a pretty exciting project. We've got, Arafura, which is a $1.3 billion project in critical minerals. We've got $1 billion phosphate project. We've got TNG, which is titanium and vanadium. You might have saw yesterday we had the commencement of core lithium, and these projects are developing in regions where there currently is nothing but some remote indigenous communities, a single rail track running through. So the logistics task and the infrastructure task, it is an exciting space to be working in. It's also that I do also always note that we actually don't talk about ESG in the NT. We talk about ESCG because there's no way that you operate in the territory without considering cultural impacts. So we have 30% of our population is Indigenous, and to me, one of my takeouts, I think Nova Peris's presentation yesterday was probably one of the best I've seen in person. Thought it was amazing. But right now we have mining projects that have 30% Indigenous workforce. So things are changing, and it's our job to make sure that these 27 projects that are national scale projects happen in a way that everybody in those regions benefits and everyone gets that improvement to life. I think Kate was going to go second on this one, talking about context.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So to put into context, there's a couple of things that came to my mind as a result of what was said yesterday and some of the presentations this morning. Let's not underestimate the task that we have to actually transform the energy system. It's quite, it's enormous, to put it mildly. But underpinning that is where we start from. So we have to understand that what we've done in our country is we have privatised most of our networks. Queensland's one of the few which didn't privatise its networks. The transmission systems are by nature, they are a natural monopoly, so therefore they are regulated. Over the period of the last 2 decades, the regulated networks have not really undertaken much transmission planning, and the reason that that transmission planning hasn't really taken place is because at the start of the market it was a problem. They couldn't figure out how to solve transmission planning because that's centralised planning, and the economics of a market says, oh, you don't have centralised planning really in markets. But with a power system which is complex, you actually require that level of detail and thinking to make everything flow around the system in an efficient manner. So for at least 2 decades, if not 3 decades, we have not really had transmission planning doing what it needed to do to suit the future. Transmission lines could be built for loads and justified on regulated income, but not for new generation. And the problem that exists is we have been living off the fat of the planning that was done in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And the end result of that is, as you can see from the announcements this morning, and the Queensland Government announcement is a typical one, so is the urgency of the ISP projects, is that all of a sudden in the last 4 years, transmission is urgent because people can see that it has to be there because otherwise we can't efficiently, I call it a fundamental circuit theory problem. We have been oversubscribing the transmission lines that were put in for rural electrification for our agriculture and regional towns. And now what we're trying to do is cram the future generation projects into those lines under an open access regime, which allows overselling the rating of that line to additional projects. And the end result is it's all congested and people probably run the risk that they're not going to make money out of their projects. And a lot of the project's focus is, I want to make money out of energy. I don't have to understand the power system, right? So this is the sort of context that we're going into, and really there is a serious need for what we once had inside NEMCO was a National Transmission Network Development Plan. It went nowhere, it got stopped. So the problem that we've got now is dealing with this urgent requirement, and this is why the ISP appears to have some of the answers. Is it a good plan? Some engineers would question whether it's actually really coherently put together the problem in the way that we need to actually solve this problem. So that was the other one. And the last context is that we are facing an enormous opportunity to become a renewable energy superpower. That's what Ross Garnaut said last week when he launched his book. They've basically put together how we're going to transform into this renewable energy superpower. The problem that we've got is we need to be able to grasp that opportunity for the national interest and actually make sure that when we do allow that development to occur, the regions get the benefit, not in the same manner as what happened with the resource boom, where it was sort of disappeared and didn't come out with the benefits that the country really should have grasped.
That's excellent. Thank you, Kate. Lou?
So the main roads context is a little bit different to that context. So in terms of main roads, we have, as I said before, we're very geographically spread, which means that our roads, in some cases, are the lifeblood of communities. We have a $3 billion spend every year around our major infrastructure investments, and now we're being asked to leverage that spend even more to provide some greater benefits to the communities that we're rolling these projects out in. So these are remote communities, very small economies, and they have their own individual challenges around employment and the equity that sits behind within that economy itself. So there's even to an extent of there's skill capabilities that might not be there, as well as we're also experiencing very low rates of unemployment in those areas to begin with. Also throw into that context, there's massive economic powerhouses in terms of mining in some of these remote locations, which adds an element of criticality to those roads. Again, this is a challenge around equality and equity which is also recognised at federal level as part of the SDG report. There is a disparity above the 26th parallel and above in terms of the infrastructure that rolled out. Quite often, it's where the money flows, and it's the mining industry is being supported, but there's local communities, there's an inequity in the access that's provided to some very remote and regional communities, and that can be seen in the differing investment from in Western Australia compared to maybe some connecting roads in the Northern Territory. Then on another layer on top of that, there is climate vulnerability already with these roads and the road infrastructure. They're the lifeblood of these communities. There's not necessarily other modes of transport, other ways of getting around. The people there are very car dependent, and that's the context that they live in. There's not that network of roads that mishmash and crisscross each other to create redundancy and different ways of getting around. These people in these communities are very reliant on the infrastructure that is provided for them, more so than probably us here or people in the cities and in more regional locations. I suppose that's the main roads context.
Yep. Georgie?
Yeah, I guess the context I sort of really want to put into the room is really about this next 10 years. This next 10 years hasn't started particularly well. We are in the middle of what's called a disorderly transition. We haven't had the planning or thinking around the economic transition required for decarbonisation that is globally occurring. And as a result, we are going to see, you know, as came out sort of quite publicly at the AFR conference in Sydney, Energy Climate Summit on Monday, you know, over the next sort of short, medium term, we're going to see something like a 30% increase in electricity prices. At this time, we are also going to see massive activity in terms of the transport network and what has to be done, the electricity network and what has to be done for decarbonisation. To drive that decarbonisation, we are also going to require a massive boom in critical minerals development and to fuel things like bauxite mining for aluminium production, etc., because a lot of this is done with aluminium, and you're going to see the transition of mobility to electrification. The impact of this on regional communities is unparalleled. All of this is driven by what's going to come out of the ground in regional communities. So not only are we going to see that sort of transition of where currently jobs and generators are, that will move, and then we will see other regional communities rise up around these resources. I guess as a country, considering a number of things, we are trying to decarbonise. So all of the materials that we are pulling out of the ground for this transition will have carbon impacts. We're also trying to get human endeavour and activity back into planetary boundaries. We've done enormous damage to our natural environment, and we have to repair the natural environment. It's a natural consequence of the damage that we've done. And so to be able to shore up those corridors for biodiversity which impact human health, we've got to repair our natural environment. The tensions of all of this are quite extreme. And I think it's actually hard to sort of see how we do all this massive economic growth. How do we dig all that stuff out of the NT and ship it all around the world while doing everything else as well, decarbonising, restoring our natural environment? They don't seem to add up to me. So what's it about? We are fueling a global economy, and there's no doubt about that. I had this argument with a bunch of directors yesterday. It wasn't particularly edifying, but I think the point that I was trying to make was this economy is meant to serve somebody. I think it's meant to serve us, isn't it? So somehow our values have been lost in this economy. The values that mean that we care about individuals, the values that say that we care about our environment are gone. They have to be reintroduced. What does that mean? One of the things it means is that we could have a place-based conversation around the communities that are expected to pay the price, and it is a price, for this development that's going to fuel this transition. What does that look like? That means that before we provide the resources for those global companies to be earning their mega profits, that we do a better social deal. So that conversation is about where a community is going, what their ambitions are, what their values are, and starting to think about development within that context. So how can we strike a deal that provides a long-lasting future for those regions in the shape that matches, I guess, the aspirations of that region? Certainly in the communities in transition work we did in Queensland, it was clear that different regions have different values. We tend to think that everyone would be the same. They must all want what I want. No, they don't. Certainly if you go to the north of Queensland in the Cookshire, large First Nations culture, their core value is family. They want a future that is good for their family. And so they see the world through that lens, and they would like to think about how the jobs of their future generations and what they might like to do so that they don't get too far removed from family. It's a different, if you come down to central Queensland, totally different set of values. They have been used to more industrialisation. They they quite like innovation. They like industrialisation. They're prepared to accept a different deal and different values, and they're wanting to look at development in a different way. I think, one thing that we can't afford to see, and it is a big argument in Queensland, is another LNG. The reverberations of those projects, the lack of collaboration and the way that those projects were designed, that community is still reeling, and frankly, the rest of Australia is still reeling because of the way that was designed not to serve an economic benefit back to broader Australia. It was designed to, and effectively, massively impacted our manufacturing sector. That's not okay. That's our resource, and everyone paid the price. So I think, from my perspective, and the context that we need to set is, how do we start to get our social and environmental values back into the deal for this next 10 years of transition to ensure that at the end of this 10 years, we know who we are, we recognise the country that we live in, and the places that we love are preserved, and that we haven't sold out to this massive industrialisation that needs to occur for global decarbonisation. I think I'll leave it there.
So that is excellent. That is really excellent. I don't think there's anyone who would sort of disagree with that logic.
How to do it is the challenge.
So we were getting into the third thing we were going to talk about is what does success look like, and so what does success look like from each of our perspectives, and from mine. On the one hand, it's very, very simple. I currently have 27 projects who list their biggest risk is their supply chain, logistics, getting to market from very, very, very remote Australia. And so, success looks like those 27 are operating in a way, on the more real answer is that those 27 are operating in a way that we've all, along the way we've created community distribution centres. So a little bit more in a context, we have plenty of communities in the Northern Territory that are inaccessible for over 6 months of the year, every year. I think that's probably hard to imagine when you're in southeast Queensland, but 6 months of the year inaccessible by road. We're airdropping medical supplies and food supplies, regularly every year. So how do we make sure we have community distribution? Just basic fundamentals like that. How do we have pathways to long-term careers in those regions, because the majority of those regions do prioritise being on country in and around family. So when we've used our infrastructure investments to change the lives of people in and around the regions for the better. And I think that's what we're all in there. And when we're building community resilience throughout our very remote regions. I think another key takeaway from me, if I can, is that it's not just good for the Territory, and it's not just good for those very remote regions if we get this right. It's actually imperative for Australia. It's actually imperative for the entire country that we get our remote regions functioning well. So for any number of reasons, on a basic economics front, of course, but also because we can't just keep building congestion in our capital cities when we've got huge open spaces in the most north of our country. That is the closest proximity to the international market. We can't, national connectivity has been recommended in everything from the bushfire emergencies to AdBlue shortages. The entire country is affected when our national network isn't functioning. Apart from the fact that we need our regions contributing to the national economy. And it's just the right thing to do. Closing the gap, regional equality, all of those things are just the right thing to do, because there's no Australian that should be not able to access those benefits that the rest of us take for granted. So, Louis, we haven't gone to you first.
Yep.
What does success look like for you in Main Roads, WA?
I'll talk about two areas, circular economy, but also Aboriginal participation. So from our infrastructure investments, we've got some clear policy and clear targets around driving the growth of the circular economy, but also Aboriginal participation on an ongoing manner. So for us, I think I'll focus on the circular economy first. Success would look like, I think, realising the challenges that there are in regional areas is just developing small economies around recycling and better waste management and utilisation in our regional areas and our remote areas, because that's a massive challenge. I think sometimes it's put into the too hard basket to look at recycling in the circular economy in these areas because it's so far away from where industry is. But there's the opportunity here to drive the development of industry and the development and set that platform for the circular economy to come through and to be developed in some of these locations when you have the opportunity to do it. The key there is to make sure it's ongoing and to support it ongoing. The same can be said for Aboriginal participation. There's some quite clear challenges for our infrastructure investments to meet. So we've got some quite stringent targets, but success for Aboriginal participation is, I think, from what we've been told, I think it's more so not for us as an organisation. We should be looking at it from the community that we're actually providing for and providing these opportunities for. So for them, some of the things that we've heard from our consultation and what we've got as feedback, this is more around being able to work on country and to work on country ongoing. In that, there's a very specific challenge that we need to meet, because it's all right to have one project go through and then train people up and have them work in a safe, comfortable environment, but that needs to trigger more opportunities and greater employment opportunities on an ongoing basis. And then it's just bringing it back to, we won't need targets in the future. I think ultimately, the ultimate vision here is it'll just be a level playing field. There'll be this is, I guess, the dreamer in me thinking about this. It'll just be business as usual. We'll just have this resource of people who are available and capable, and it doesn't matter what their background is. It's just common practice, and that's the way we should be, and that's the dream I think we need to take in and strive for.
Excellent. Kate?
Right, well, there's a large number of thoughts that come to my mind when Georgine talked about the disorderly transition, because I've spent the last probably 8 years fighting to ensure that we didn't have a disorderly transition when it comes to the coal-fired power stations, but it seems to be the case that it's going to happen a lot faster than what we all thought. I'm going to put circular economy in there into control engineering terms, because it occurs to me that that's exactly what you're trying to do. Up until now, I think the economic process has been to treat the world like it's infinite, forget the natural capital, don't have to account for it, and effectively just do whatever as if living systems don't matter. I actually subscribe to Avery Lovin's work in natural capital, and I basically believe that you should do all your engineering as if living systems matter. But let's go back to control engineering and what the circular economy is. Effectively, what you're trying to do is create a closed loop control system where you're actually controlling what the output is so that you're not doing damage. So if we think about the market in the power system, we do closed loop control to eliminate error, to reduce error, but you cannot eliminate error. And that control feedback is what brings you closer to your set point if you manage it correctly. So the market itself, what we've been able to prove is that the market has actually pushed error into the system at cost, and then there were additional services being paid for to correct the error badly, and everybody was paying for it. So this is what happened in September 2020. We actually did retune the entire eastern seaboard across the last 2 years to correct that error. They're still fighting at a regulatory level that they want to go back to what they had because they all got addicted to the millions of dollars that were there in the market. So this is the problem that can occur on a wide scale when you forget the fundamentals of control or what you're trying to achieve as your output. And when I think about the issues in the remote communities, the task, if we go back and we look at the bushlight projects which Ikistika put out, like the predecessor to Ikistika did 15 years ago in Northern Territory, we know that the remote areas which are still working well are the areas where the people who were trained in the maintenance and keeping those systems working, those systems are working reasonably well today, whereas others where they've lost their skill or lost the people involved or the training has not been passed on, those systems are not as reliable and probably failing. So we've got an enormous task to try to figure out how do we decarbonise a lot of the remote power supplies which are effectively operated on subsidised diesel. And so the problem that you've got where you've got price setting or subsidisation, and this is a key point up in the East Kimberley as well, where there's an incentive for people to put PV on their roof because that'll reduce their bill and their usage from the system. But the trouble that you've got is you've got to control and be able to keep that system working on a whole. And at the moment, the PV doesn't actually have that control. So we've got this problem to try to work out how do we balance and actually introduce renewable energy to these areas to get rid of the diesel, because it's possible, we've got the technology to do it, but also ensure that the subsidised diesel that we're offsetting, which the government's going to get the money back from, actually translates into a benefit for the householders in that area. And that's a conundrum that's actually in existence in a lot of places. The people in Kununurra are paying a fixed price for power that's the same price as it is in Perth, but their power, which comes from hydro, is the cheapest in WA. So they've got an incentive to put PV on their roof, but that actually offsets another renewable energy and undermines the business case for the hydro. So you know, you can sort of see there's a conundrum there which has been created by a pricing mechanism. So there are issues in the way that we roll out regulation and the way that we do treat some of this stuff, because not all circumstances are well thought through. And I sort of see that as a key area where we've got to find success to actually solve that conundrum while decarbonising those small power systems, and the big one as well.
I agree. Georgine?
Where to start? It's just so much, isn't there? All of these systems. Look, I think at the macro level, if I were to say, you know, what would success look like? For me, it would look like I sort of kind of have this idealistic notion of taking a state's economy and giving that to regions to manage based on regional objectives for their own future and perhaps partnered with some social impact bonds that are also interested in seeing the successful transition of regions. So allowing regional communities to set their own objectives and to deliver their own sort of economic and social outcomes. I think New South Wales, with the way that they have defined their regional plans, is very good, and those regions are spoken about often in an economic context that I think is quite healthy, and I think it you know, and what was done there is a lot of work was done to identify, I guess, the DNA of a region to some extent, and the aspirations of that region, and then the question was asked, what infrastructure do they need to be successful to deliver that? And then how can the state ensure that sort of investment flows in that way? I'm sure it's not perfect at this point in time, but it's a start, and I'm not sure that necessarily that is carried through in other states. In terms of infrastructure, let's take these industrial precincts. If we rush those forward without stopping and thinking how they could be done different, we will do the same as we have always done. We're doing it already on hydrogen. you know, all of the money is being thrown at these precincts. No one's thinking about, you know, the presumption is, of course, that all of this kit and caboodle will be developed out of all brand new virgin material. But we have an industry in the oil and gas industry that will be going into decline. We have assets there that can be repurposed and reused for the new industry. That would also create local jobs, of course, and it would be quite interesting. We're also not thinking about the fact that our renewable energy zones, for example, which is going to be the power that runs all of this, will produce a finite amount of electricity. So if you've got 100 gigawatt coming out of a renewable energy zone, is the most effective use of that to turn that into hydrogen and ship it to Germany so that they can continue their decarbonised industrial activity? Or should we be thinking about, talk to Germany about bringing back onshore remanufacturing in Australia and using our renewable and decarbonised energy source to perhaps do that local manufacturing? Would that be of interest to local communities? I'm guessing it might. So unless we have these conversations and think about what we could do, what the future holds, and I think we've got a short window of opportunity before we start down this mad harum-scarum towards this decarbonisation journey. You can feel it, we're on the cusp of it. Can we stop and have a conversation about what the potential is, what different narratives might come forward? And I tell you where the answers will be in the regional communities who are going to be very much part of this story. So I suppose I would love to see some sophisticated government activity that brings forward the conversation, starts to think about new ideas, is open to actually changing course should a great idea come forward. Because, I mean, I think that's half the problem. We seem to start and then there's no pulling it back. And also really thinking about the social contract. How do we reframe that contract so that we don't have FIFO workforces? How do we ensure that the social infrastructure exists for the workforces that are going to be put in? How do we make sure that our teachers, nurses and other essential workers don't end up working for hydrogen and leaving these systems broken? How do we ensure that when all of this leaves town that we don't have a sorry mess of ridiculous real estate sort of issues that we've had in Gladstone? We know all of this. Could we do it differently, please? Can we have a conversation about that? I think success, to my mind, would be that we've had that conversation and we've all gone down this road together. That would be fantastic.
Excellent. So we've got about 18 seconds looking at the clock until we're supposed to be opening for questions. So, sorry?
It's a big clock.
It is a big clock. So perhaps if everyone wants, if you have questions for anyone on the panel, you can put them through. I'm assuming you all know how to do the questions because I can't explain it if you don't. So if you put your questions through, and in the meantime, we might take maybe a 30-second recap.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on what Georgine said. And if I think about, and I've been involved in quite a number of renewable energy projects, just one project in a regional town can fill up all the accommodation, just one. And the volume of projects that are on the books for the next 5-10 years is enormous, and I think it's critical that we get that conversation about how we handle what does the community want as a result of all this activity, because it's a very intensive economic activity in a very short period of time during construction. And then there's a small workforce afterwards for maintenance, but that is not necessarily, you know, that doesn't fulfil what you needed during the construction period. So at the moment, I think in some of the renewable energy zones, and by the way, the whole of Queensland is a renewable energy zone, 3 of them. Naturally, your power system falls into 3 zones. When I was at NEMCO, we used to forecast it as 3, and it's still 3. And the end result is all 3 have been declared as renewable energy zones. The volume of projects that will go into those particular areas that are declared as renewable energy zones will be 10, 14 projects plus the transmission, plus that sort of build. So the question becomes one of, what does the community really want in that area? And there's also, one lasting thing is transmission easements are not easy discussions with the community. They are, people don't like transmission lines. It takes time, it takes effort, and really, my opinion on this, we should be optimising the existing easements that we have. That currently isn't the plan. Some places there is, but a lot of new transmission is being proposed. So the question becomes one of how many paddock trees do we cut down as we go in a straight line from A to B? You know, what are we thinking about? We can't afford to do what the Western Highway did in Victoria. One of the projects that I've been, the landowners of one of the wind projects, her 90-year-old mother was tying herself naked to some of those river redglums to try and stop that highway.
Oh, it's awful.
It's tragic because the road goes in a straight line and they forget, oh yeah, there's a 400-year-old tree in the way. What do we do about it? You can't replace it. So, you know, the trouble is this is the sort of thing that comes into conflict with communities.
I'll just quickly add, yeah, we experience the same issues with fly in, fly out, but in some of the most unexpected areas where in WA you think fly in, fly out, it's the Pilbara, it's the mining communities. We just recently had a road project go through a town of Albany, which is where you don't think about fly in, fly out. And that workforce had to be, we didn't think about that going in, so there was a bit of a problem that was created because of that. And so I think you need to have forward planning to make sure that that when you're doing these projects, and this was a relatively small project as well. I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we have these policy levers we've asked them to do, but you can't necessarily force it on communities because there's got to be an appetite there and the economy there, and it might take a little bit of time to build that and build that early into your procurement.
Or is there some amenity that comes along with your project which could actually be designed in a way that it's of a benefit to the community after, that provides affordable housing, it provides something with it. You don't just, oh, here are the dongers, whoops, now we're taking them away. Yep.
I think it feeds into one of these, that whole conversation, a great questions here. So in terms of creating long-term social, cultural, environmental and economic value for regional communities, can you think of an example where you've seen it done really well? So, have we got examples of where it's been done really well? We've sort of talked about some examples of where it maybe hasn't been done so well.
I'm going to jump in. I'm going to talk about a project that I thought did really great things for Aboriginal participation. So it's the Outback Way project, and so that really focused on trying to make an ongoing program for the local Aboriginal businesses and the community there. So it became an alliance project. They set it up with a very specific contract structure, so then they could fold in the workforce, fold in the businesses and provide coaching and mentoring to lift them up, but then structured the overall program of works. So then over 10 years, over a long period, they're delivering that infrastructure. So then there's that ongoing basis of, and which really impacted that community quite significantly. The main roads people talk about the positive social impact that's been having on those local communities because of just the uplift from providing that opportunity.
Did either of you have an example you want to flag?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because if we look at the early days of the wind industry, your landowner does get a benefit across their agricultural property, you know, their farm, that they effectively drought-proof it because they do get such good income from the lease arrangement with the wind turbine. So depending on how many turbines you get quite good annual income. What has evolved over the life of these projects is a lot of them do community funds. Well, the question is that as much value as what it could be? Should it be put to better use? Is there better ways of thinking about it? The other thing that's happening is that neighbours who are impacted to some degree, sometimes by noise or even just the loss of visual amenity, which is now becoming sort of a thing, you have to extend the way that wind projects look at who in the community should benefit, what type of compensation is available. But does this actually then also mean that overall the project is actually welcomed into the community in a way that brings jobs, education, skills, value for staying in the area, and has a positive impact on the community rather than a divisive impact on the community? And I think that's still a work in progress with the wind industry. And there's an awful lot of, I'll say, European investment that's coming into the country. They haven't really always dealt with their community consultation quite as well as they could have. I think it's a continual sort of relearning a lot of the time. So it's a watching space, I think, when it comes to that.
We definitely have projects that I think are doing things very well. So if you think we've got one that's actually in Tennant Creek, pretty remote compared to what most people would think of. They're actually reprocessing tailings, so it's an existing environmental liability that they are reducing. They are doing everything they can to have no FIFO workforce, so they fly in a couple of mine managers because they can't find those skills locally. But they have 30% Indigenous workforce, and that's been going for quite a while now. And they're moving into stage 2, so they've done so well in their first stage that they're moving into stage 2, going into cobalt. And now, but they did have to get up and running on diesel, and now they're looking at working with us to do a bioenergy plant. So it's actually, step by step, but I think they're doing pretty fantastic things to be on site in Tennant Creek, getting up like that. A second question, Louis. Oh, do you want to answer that one, Georgina?
I've got a couple of examples, but they won't be short. Do you have time? You've got to finish up.
Well, up to you if we want to go to a second question.
Yeah, probably only, I was going to say, not a project so much, but an approach in terms of a region. Certainly some work that I funded in my previous role, but done in collaboration with a local region, was the Western region of Queensland, who wanted to develop a circular economy vision for itself. It's called the Rapid Big Vision, if you would like to look it up. But that was essentially a place-based consultation on a future vision for a community that had some really big social issues. The land mass is absolutely extraordinary. You're talking 10,000 people, but diminishing numbers, sort of quite, tough social sort of decline that's occurring there. But of course, the potential for renewable energy out there and their vision to be a renewable energy superpower has been brought forward by the collection of councils out there, and they've been very, very blessed to have the support of Ross Garnaut, who in fact spent his COVID pandemic isolation in that region, so was doing some fantastic things. But in that conversation, this community, particularly integrated with First Nations people, came up with an extraordinary vision for themselves in terms of agriculture, land, food production, etc. It's an example of how sophisticated a region can be when given an opportunity to speak for itself in a really supported consultation. So I would recommend that to you as some reading.
Yep. All right, well, we're flashing and we're over time. So